I want to welcome everyone to this, our first ever ALA on-air event. With this event, we are opening up our lines of communication. Our goal is to bring the feel of a local web development meetup to the web, enabling a couple thousand of our closest friends to connect with our staff and our authors. We want you asking us the tough questions. We want you asking the stuff we don't have answers for just yet, so we can figure it all out with you. I also wanted like a radio host style soundboard so I can make air horn noises and stuff, but literally everyone said no. So today we are going to focus on the whole making websites thing, I guess. We want to thank Pantheon for sponsoring us, which allows us to try out new things like this very event. That's pantheon.io. They provide managed hosting for Drupal and WordPress sites. So you can focus on building cool stuff instead of fiddling around with servers and infrastructure and whatever the cloud is. So we are here today to talk about performance. I just got back from an event apart Atlanta, and the talks focusing on performance outnumbered the ones that didn't by a huge margin. This stuff is clearly on everyone's mind. So building a smaller, faster website is a huge technical challenge, but it's more than that too. It means everything from changing minds within your organization to conscientious design decisions. How do we get our teams and the people that sign the paychecks as excited about building performant websites as we are? How do we keep performance in mind through every step of the design and development process? And once we're all done talking and thinking and selling people on performance, where do we get started actually building a faster website? So to answer all these questions and then some, we have brought together some of the greatest minds in web performance today. We have Lara. I don't know, you guys raise your hands when I say your names out loud, I guess. I'm an accomplished moderator, as I'm sure you can all tell. We have Lara Hogan, author of the O'Reilly book Designing for Performance, and a voluntary New Yorker, for reasons a Bostonian like myself can never understand. Lara runs an in-house team of performance-minded engineers at Etsy. We have Scott Jehl, author of a book of parts, Responsible Responsive Web Design. He had the dubious honor of working with me back when I worked at Filament Group, which is a Boston agency known for developing accessible and highly performant websites for clients. We have Yesenia Perez-Cruz, who is an event-apart speaker and a list-apart employee of the month, which is the thing I made up just now. Yesenia is an in-house designer at Intuitive Company, focusing on designing for performance. And there's me. I am custodial engineer at a list apart, and I will be your humble moderator for today's event. So we're going to lead off. We have 30 minutes of open discussion where I am going to ask some questions, and you guys are going to answer, and they will be difficult. It's mostly like quiz show style and has nothing to do with performance after. So, when we talk about performance, what precisely are we talking about? Like, how do we define fast when it comes to web performance? So show of hands. Who wants to go first?
Do you want to go in order how you introduced us? Or?
That's actually a good idea. Again, accomplished moderator.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Really putting me on the spot. All right, so yeah, sure, I'll take it first. So I think we used to always talk about performance in terms of, how long a page takes to load in completion. But these days we're talking a lot more about perceived performance, so how fast a site feels. So I think that when we're talking about performance in this panel, we'll be talking not just about how the site loads overall, but also how fast something feels.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think perceived performance is the focus, and when we're thinking about that, we're sort of aiming at what's become sort of a de facto standard of maybe 1 second or so on a reasonably fast connection to get something usable to the person, and then on a slower connection, through G, something like in the range of 2 seconds would be incredible. So that's I think those are the sort of goals we're thinking about as far as what's fast enough.
Yeah, and I think that the focus on perceived performance is really helpful because it really makes us focus on the people that are using the site and considering performance as part of the user experience just as anything else in the site. Just as we would consider a really usable navigation, we would consider performance something that we need to consider for the people that are coming to our site and needing to access our content and our services.
So how do we measure that then? If we're looking at this strictly from like the user's perspective, what is the best way for us as developers? I mean, in a relatively privileged browsing context with new browsers and fast computers and bandwidth everywhere but where I am right now. How do we look at that from the user's perspective best?
So I'll kick it off by talking about a tool called Web Page Test, which is probably the easiest tool to use. You can type in the URL that you want to measure and choose a location from around the globe, so you can get a sense of how your users, globally are actually experiencing your site. They will also help you see how it loads over mobile. They'll give you a shaped 3G connection if you want. And then they can give you a total waterfall, which is a way to see how your page is loading with number of requests and how big they are, etc. But they'll also give you things like a film strip view and a video, so you can actually feel how that site is loading for those users.
Yeah, I can't agree more. Web Page Test is so integral to our workflow now. Pretty much every time we make a major commit to a code base, it'll go up into a branch that has a preview URL, and we'll just funnel it right into Web Page Test and see how it impacted performance. And Lara mentioned the film strip view. I think that's really become particularly handy for us because perceived performance is measurable, but it can be a little subjective as well. Depending on the page, we find certain types of pages have different content, and you have to prioritize portions of the page that should be usable first, and what deems a page usable kind of varies depending on the type of content on the page. So that summary view that the Web Page Test brings us is nice for quick numbers, I guess, like it started rendering at 600 milliseconds or something like that. But looking at that timeline view, we can say, well, right around 900 milliseconds is where we're actually rendering fonts and text. Something's actually usable.
I also think the timeline view is super helpful when it comes to comparing competitor sites. So especially if I'm talking to a client and I can show them how long it took for the first byte to load on their site versus their competitors, that can be really compelling to show a client.
Absolutely.
And I'll add, so we're talking about stuff that's like live, stuff that you can actually point Web Page Test to. But there's also Web Page Test, you can run a local instance if you really want, or if you don't need to get that fancy. While you're developing something, Chrome DevTools has a ton of performance tooling. You can see, for instance, frames per second, so you can see if there's a ton of scrolling jank and it's really stuttery. And then you can also see a waterfall and plenty of other things about performance.
Yeah, I agree. Browser DevTools are kind of, I think, the immediate easiest step while you're actually hitting refresh and working with the code, and then once it's up, something like Web Page Test. Also, PageSpeed Insights has some really nice, especially their documentation, really nice recommendations for telling you tips about why your page might have certain bottlenecks that you could fix.
Cool. Do you guys use any of the bandwidth throttling standalone OS 10 apps or Windows apps or any of that stuff? Have you had a lot of success with those? If so.
Scott, have you?
Yeah. There's network link conditioner. I've used that a bit. The new throttling that's built into Chrome DevTools is pretty handy, I've found, especially just to throttle it way back and start looking at how assets layer in on a almost unrealistically slow connection, just to see how priorities are organized.
I was going to ask if those are sufficiently terrible for real-world testing, like dropping packets, or is it like the ideal perfect world 3G where no one else is using a phone anywhere,
Yeah, I wish we had that 3G here. We don't.
specifically, you guys, while all focused on performance, you all come at it from sort of a different angle. Lara, you come at it from more of an organizational angle. Scott, you're a nerd, and do a lot of stuff with semicolons, I hear. JavaScript or whatever. I'm not really familiar with web development. And Yesenia, you're a design-focused person. So I'd kind of like you guys to just sort of freely discuss among yourselves, like, what are the differences in approach there? Like, speaking from like a dev standpoint, you sit down and you make the website go quicker. But there's way more to it than like that final step in the baton handoff, where you have to sell clients on it, you have to sell supervisors on it, you get your whole team on board, that sort of thing. So it would be cool if you guys could talk a little bit about your roles in the process of building a more performant website.
Yeah, definitely. Order. So from my perspective, so I work at Etsy, and I'm the performance engineering manager here. So I lead a team of developers whose job it is to help all the product teams start to make their stuff faster as they're adding to the website. So I've got a couple of interesting pieces there. Like, I have to convince these developers and designers to care about this stuff, and I have to make sure the upper management is on board. But I'm in a unique, very fortunate and privileged position because all the people I need to convince are sitting around me, which is why I think it's fascinating when I hear Scott and Yesenia talk about their work, because it's so much like convincing people who you're not around, who aren't your coworkers all the time, to get them to care about this stuff.
You can't punch them in the shoulder, is what you're saying.
Right, yeah. I can't bribe them, like I can my coworkers.
Sure.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the advice that Lara gives in her book, for example, about how you really have to take performance culture into your organization really translates to how we talk to our clients. Because from the first step, first kickoff meeting, it has to be a priority and everyone has to care about it.
Yeah.
And I find it's not that hard to get people to care about it because performance is really relatable to really anyone who uses the web, right? It doesn't have to be a technical discussion. It's pretty simple. Just how quickly can you access the service that you deliver? And typically we'll have a lot of statistics to back up why other people care so much about how fast particular sites load. But yeah, I think there's a lot to that point that Laura talks about a lot. Trying to get everyone rather than just the development team or just the design team. Yeah, everybody.
Yeah, so I started caring about speaking about performance because I'd seen a lot of talks that focus primarily on implementation and how to optimize after something has gone through approvals and the design phase. And there's really so many things that need to happen before you get to the implementation phase in terms of performance. Because if something is signed off on that contains huge images or a ton of fonts, it's just going to be way more difficult to meet that end goal. I think my challenge with this is that I typically work with clients that have, maybe they've just undergone a big branding redesign that they love and they're really into the idea of using a ton of typefaces, or they're really gung-ho on this new technique, or they want to redesign so they can have a carousel. So a lot of what I focus on is helping clients prioritize what elements of their brand will have, one, the most brand impact, because we still want to create an experience that's memorable, that's going to make people come back. So we need some elements that still have brand impact, but also, and I think Tim Kadlec has said this, the most impact for the least amount of pain overall. So how can we still create a memorable experience that communicates the brand, that makes the marketing team happy and feel like it really reflects who they are, but also provides an overall really solid user experience. So I primarily work in finding that middle ground and communicating the benefits of finding a middle ground there.
So to that point then, what is the best number of carousels to have for performance, would you say? Clearly we'll need at least one.
0 carousels.
Okay. I mean, I average around 3 per page.
Nested carousels.
Sure. Carousels within carousels. I mean, more realistically to that point, would you say does that make for a lot of strained looks around a desk when you kind of have to make those compromises? Like, I'm sure that's a hard sell for a lot of people when they say, we want 75 fonts, and you say, no, you may not. That's the start to a tough conversation sometimes.
Right. To me, it's come down to, again, the conversation that all of this is part of the user experience and communicating how the business goals and the user needs that have already been defined at the beginning of the project, how performance is going to help you solve those things. I think it can be a little bit tricky if I'm saying, like, no, you can't have this if they really want it. But communicating how it's going to impact the overall user experience and overall complete the goals of the project is how I approach that.
And since that's also client-facing, Scott, how would you say that lines up with your experience having those conversations? Because I'm sure there's a lot of times, even if everything's designed with performance in mind, by the time it gets to the dev process, it's like, maybe we could just sneak in one more italic. Like, how do you handle that same conversation, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Lately, we talked about perceived performance. I think we've realized lately that a lot of the optimizations you make don't have to necessarily cut in code weight, but more so just prioritize the ways in which you're loading your assets, so that something usable is delivered a lot sooner, and the nice-to-have elements come in at their own convenience. So I guess perceived performance is nice in that way because you can sort of satisfy all of the business concerns, I guess, that are always there, training guidelines, things like that. But there are two sides to that coin. There's the perceived performance angle. There's also just overall page weight, which does still matter because it actually costs people money, right? Like, so if you're paying for your data on a rechargeable SIM or something like much of the world does, every request takes money and time usually. So it is important. It's kind of a balance. We have to, even though we can deliver a really large page relatively quickly, we still have to keep our eye on it.
Mm-hmm. Lara, how would you say that compares to, your coworkers?
Right.
You have a rapport with, everybody knows each other, you punch and bribe them. Do you run into situations where they're like, well, let's just do this one extra font? And do you have to kind of like rein that in ever?
Yeah. So it happens two ways generally. One is we'll get a new hire, right? So somebody who just doesn't know that this is part of the culture, or just doesn't recognize, or doesn't know how to measure it as they're building it. Sure. We've had stuff go out that's like 10, 12 megabytes before we notice that something has happened, and then we realize, okay, this is someone new, and they need some training. But more often than not, performance is sneaky. Like, something will just slowly creep up over time because no one's watching it. So more of our work has to do with, alerting, making sure that we're measuring this stuff routinely, and then we can easily go and check in with the team later and say, hey, we noticed that there's a performance regression. Here's how you can fix it, or here's what you can do about it. More often than not, too, if somebody's building something out and they want to just sneak in the extra font, we'll do what Yesenia recommends, is have a performance budget, and that we can have a little bit of cap and trade, like, oh, you want to add an extra 48 kilobytes of fonts? Go find that somewhere else. Go save that somewhere else on the page.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the carousel.
I've dealt with that because even if we agree and the client is like, oh yeah, we want a fast site, they'll still try to sneak something in or say, but can't we have this also? So finding a way to find a compromise is definitely helpful. Something that I've done with a performance budget in terms of picking a set of fonts to use, because fonts can have so many various weights and really become a large resource, is to figure out for my developers how much of a budget I can spend on fonts, and then go back to the client with variations and options, and have a conversation about which option is a better translation of your brand while still, keeping within a budget. So I found that having conversations like that where we're evolving the brand experience together instead of me just saying no has been a lot more helpful.
Right. So how does that work when you've spoken to the client, you've spoken to the dev team, you've spoken to your own internal team, everybody's sold, everyone's on board, everyone's being very careful about, the 10 megabyte pings that they're putting wherever, avoiding regressions. What happens when that gets handed off? Because at some step in the process, either the design goes to the dev team that may not be sold, or it goes to the client who has to maintain it long term, or it just goes to some other part of your organization. How do you, without threats of physical violence, which is my go-to, how do you maintain all the work that you've put in? How do you convey the importance of it to another team altogether who, for all intents and purposes, doesn't really have to care?
Mm-hmm.
I could say for this one. In client services, we typically do at Filament, we do a lot of the front end and integration work. So we'll hand off our somewhat static assets to their team and work with them to work in the live code base. And once it's built, we usually set up some sort of monitor to lead them with, after we're gone. One of those tools, Tim Panelist, is a really great tool. It ties right into web page tests from the command line, and anytime you commit and run the command line tasks on it, it'll make sure that you're keeping with whatever budget for each template on your site that you have to set up ahead of time. So I think that's really nice. There are other monitoring tools. I'm not too familiar with others personally.
I think something that's important also, because a lot of sites that I've designed have a ton of image assets, and images are a huge resource, is a lot of education and documentation about how to optimize the images. They tend to be the thing that gets forgotten in the implementation phase, where we can optimize the HTML and CSS as much as we want, but then if they go in and upload giant uncompressed images, it's going to completely weigh the site down. So that's been a big thing.
Yeah, and I'd add that, with any site, as it grows and evolves over time, like things are going to shift a little bit, things are going to change. Like I mentioned before, new people will get hired. Maybe all of a sudden content editors can start adding stuff that they weren't able to. Things happen, right? Things get bloated. So what I've found is, automated testing is great. Let's get some alerting from third parties to help watch our stuff for us. But also it's really good. I routinely give a presentation to Etsy that's like basics of designing for performance, basics of image optimization, basics of how we do things here, just to kind of get everybody on the same page and remind them that this stuff is important. Mostly because I don't believe that there should be any performance cops or performance janitors. I don't want my team to come through and have to clean up, after somebody else's mess. I don't want them to have to come with a hammer and say, you guys messed this up. I really want everybody just, to get it and feel empowered that they can do this stuff too.
Sure.
Yeah, and Lara, in your book you mention a lot about style guides and how important that is to maintain a fast site in the future, which I thought was really helpful information.
Thanks.
That kind of leads me to a question. Have you guys done much performance retrofitting? By which I mean there is a website, it could be faster, and it falls to one of you to make it more fast. Which is, it's clearly not ideal. It's like saying let's add accessibility after the fact rather than building from the ground up that way. But these things do happen. When that falls to one of you, any of you, where do you start with that? Like I have a website, it's too big, it's too slow. What's the first thing I should focus on if I want to make it fast?
Yeah, Scott and I were actually just talking about this on Twitter over the weekend about some of the biggest ways that we found wins. So the place I usually look first is images. just because they're the thing that makes up the biggest page weight for us, and often they're the most easily overlooked, right? We can accidentally export an image that's too big. We can accidentally forget to compress it or optimize it after. So that's usually the first place I look when I'm seeing something for the first time.
Mm-hmm. I could continue on that with, I think one of the things that we prioritize most or tend to look at first is what's sort of casually talked about as the critical path. So everything that takes place in order of operations between when you first request that page and something shows up in your browser. A lot of those things are synchronous and need to happen in a certain order. But a lot of them can be sort of deferred, right? And by default, traditionally we haven't tended to defer them as much as we should. So you mentioned sort of retrofitting. We do a lot of performance audits at Filament. So a company with an existing site will come to us and say, can you find any ways that we could make this load a lot faster, especially on mobile connections? And that's one of the first places we look, whether or not they have JavaScript files and CSS files linked from the head that are blocking the page from rendering until they finish loading and parsing on the client side. That's a big deal. It's kind of like a potential single point of failure, right? Anytime we're sort of waiting for an additional request while the page is here, but it won't be shown until all those requests finish up. So trying to defer as much as possible. And I think that probably the biggest tool, the advantage that we've found lately in that regard is CSS inlining, because you really want a good portion of your CSS to be in the head of the page, so you don't get a sort of flash of unstyled content before the page renders. But you generally don't want all of your CSS. So what we do lately is use some tooling, sometimes grunt tools, things like that, to figure out which portion of your style sheet is actually critical to render the top portion of the page. And we inline that portion and load the whole style sheet in a way that doesn't block rendering. And I have to say, in the last 2 years, that's been the most significant impact to perceived performance. Just that one approach, it's just incredible. We've seen loading times just cut in half just by implementing that. So that's what I'd recommend.
We are running a little short on discussion time, so this is probably going to be our last question before we get into the audience Q&A. What is coming up to facilitate making more performance sites? Like, are there any specs or tools or browser features on the horizon that you guys are really excited about that'll help us do our jobs better and make faster sites?
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of kick it off by saying HTTP2 is something that is basically here. It's a little bit tough right now to figure out what you can and can't implement for your users or what's supported, but there's plenty of new stuff that's being developed online to help you start to think about this, start to think about how it impacts things like sprites, other things you've implemented as workarounds for performance that will be unnecessary with HTTP2.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the most exciting and interesting features, I think, in HTTP2 will be server push. And once that's available to us, all of that inlining workflow that I just talked about sort of becomes irrelevant. We've sort of been faking as if we had HTTP2 before we really had it. So it's not necessarily, at least to my understanding, going to be detrimental that we've implemented these things for version 1 when we switch over to 2, but we won't need to do them as much anymore as more and more browsers begin to support it. So that'll be really nice. On top of that, font loading events, just being able to show some text ahead of time and then let our custom fonts layer in at their own convenience. Mm-hmm. My biggest pet peeve as a user, just knowing that the page is downloaded on my device and it just won't show until the fonts show up. So.
Yeah.
From the design side of things, is there anything really exciting coming up, Yesenia, that lends itself toward faster websites down the line?
I don't know if there's specifically any tools that I've seen from a design perspective. I just think that there's been so much more awareness about performance, and like you were saying, it was such a big topic at N Event Apart that I think that it'll be easier to convince people moving forward about the importance. So it'll be a little less selling.
Cool.
That's great.
Okay, we are now going to switch gears a little bit, and we are going to answer some questions coming in from everybody watching right now, which is no pressure, like a scant 1,500 people. So don't panic. Everyone's hair looks great. So I'm just going to start at the top of the list, and this is something that I've actually had asked to me and something I have considered in the past. The inlining technique, Scott, that you mentioned, the like above the fold CSS, huge performance enhancement. Like you said, can cut the perceived load time in half. It seems super gross, like to put CSS in the head of the document that way. Like it feels really clunky and like sprite sheety, like a hack that has a tremendous benefit, but seems really clunky. And I know you mentioned there are like tasks to automate that some. But has that tripped you up any? Is that slotting into your workflow in a reasonable way without being gross?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, like Laura mentioned, we have an evolving HTTP standard that'll sort of make these workarounds irrelevant, and that's great. But I think, there's a real measurable benefit to users today to implement this, at least for the next year or two. That standard is not going to be supported across all of the browsers that I need to support for quite a while, right? Mm-hmm. So it's going to be, kind of a tricky period where we're sort of thinking about both environments, I think, for a little while. But yeah, to your question, I think it is a little gross. Like now and then, a lot of performance optimizations are that way, right? Spriting, you would never want to edit a source image as one portion of a giant sprite. But thankfully, we don't usually, right? We use tools to combine our source images into a sprite. And I think of this inlining step kind of the same way, right? When we're working in our development environment, we are not working with inline CSS in the head of a HTML document. We're working with CSS files or stats files that get combined just like we always would. And to be honest, this step really stays out of our way. It takes a little upfront configuration, but we hardly think about it after that. So.
All right, what do the non-Scots think of this technique?
Yeah,
all right, you said you guys were discussing it on Twitter.
Yeah.
And the discussion leads me to believe that you may not necessarily have been 100% on board.
The reason why, what prompted me to ask Scott was, it just seems, like you said, it's kind of gross, right? And my biggest fear when I recommend things to people is, what is the operational overhead going to be for something? In the performance world, there are so many micro optimizations that you can make that just are a time suck and maybe give you 10 milliseconds here or there. So I was concerned at first when I was, it's something I recommend doing because there's an obvious benefit here, but I wasn't sure how big the benefit was until I started talking to Scott over the weekend. I'm really impressed by all of the responses, both from Scott but from plenty of other people out there about how much it saved them. The tricky part is, so I was looking at this for Etsy. Etsy's an enormous site. Etsy has a lot of A/B tests that are constantly running, which change different pieces of the site, including things that are above the fold, constantly for our users. So for us, a site as large as us, to implement something like this, it would take probably an unusual amount of operational overhead for us to implement inlining CSS. So we're right now focused on other kinds of optimizations. But that's not to say it's not going to be a huge benefit for us. It just happens to be, for a site as large as ours, going to take a lot more work to implement.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it affects every level of, or it affects every template on the site. So it's definitely something you have to look at sort of holistically, I think. Yeah. But I mean, just the idea that without that technique in place, you know, and on HTTP1, you're going to request an HTML document, and then the best case scenario is that if you're referencing CSS in a traditional way, you'll download that document, and then the browser will start parsing it and see, oh, there's a reference to a link to a CSS file. I'm going to go get that and just stop everything I'm doing, right? And not show the user this page that I already have right here. So the idea is just to avoid that second delay, right? Because latency is a big problem. All that time spent traveling on the network really adds up, especially on 3G, slower connections. So just to have the CSS that you need right there, it's kind of amazing. It starts to correlate your round trip time to the server with the time that it actually takes to start rendering your page. Kind of guarantees you'll see something in under a second.
So I'm curious about this on the same vein. Yesenia, if you went to an internal or an external dev team, and you said, put a bunch of the CSS in the head of every page, do you think that would fly? Like, how would you even begin to approach that topic?
Yeah, that would be a little bit challenging because it definitely requires people changing workflow, and people have to be willing to commit to a change in workflow and want. I feel like with performance and with dealing with different people in the team, there has to be an understanding that everyone's going to have to give a little because the end result is going to be better for the user. But if people aren't willing to do that, then it can be really challenging for the internal team or also for the client team. I'm also wondering how, and this may be a little off topic, how that technique would work if you have to load a lot of external scripts or ads, because that's something that I've run into a lot where the ads just block anything else from loading on a page.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I feel like the stuff you'd be inlining has to do with your actual website Chrome, right? So like, hopefully you get around some of the blocking issues. Scott, are you able to hear me? Nope. So Scott's probably the best person to ask this to because he's actually done it. Actually, Matt, have you done this?
I'm standing in for Scott here.
Yeah,
I actually just switched microphones myself, so this is a are you getting any of this?
Yeah.
Scott, yeah. Nope. You may have lost that altogether. That's the worst.
But yeah, Yesenia, for this case, I think that you wouldn't necessarily be inlining the stuff that the ads need to see. It's really the stuff that's part of the site Chrome. The other ad stuff is a whole other complicating factor.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to fill in as a panelist. Third-party stuff is not pleasant to deal with, and ads in particular. I use a lot of really jankety old JavaScript, like document write and whatnot, that actually makes it incredibly difficult to load them asynchronously. Like it's almost they went out of their way to make it a thing that you can't just layer on after the fact. It blocks the page render, slows everything down. We've had a little luck mitigating that with some wild hacks with like spacer divs and iframes. It's doable, but it's something that it really helps to have a direct line to somebody on the ad team with stuff like that. Like, this is going to be a responsive site. You probably want responsive ads, so everyone sees them. Let's figure something out for how to load these in a more responsive way.
Yeah.
We've lost Scott, so now we'll pause for half an hour. Everyone remain on the line. We're going to pause until Google Hangouts have been upgraded significantly. All right, so we're soldiering on. Q&A.
We got this.
That's fine. Okay. We have a Chris Coyer.
Oh, who's that?
I don't know. Some nerd.
Hey, so sorry I lost my audio. Can you hear me again?
Yes.
Great.
You're good.
You hear us.
I don't know what I missed, but good point.
We already solved it all. We solved all the performance. All the websites are better now.
Yes.
So we have Chris Coyer asking, what are some strategies for not regressing in your web performance? Which we kind of went over a little bit. But what would be cool is if you guys could give me like a soundbite apiece. Give me something super tweetable. How do we prevent regressions after we put all this work into all this performance? It's like your one big thing.
This is really hard. Thanks, Chris. I love that guy. So one thing that I have tried to prevent regressions is to make it really clear when people are making performance wins. So people are thinking about this all the time. We do this. Oh, this is not a soundbite. I'm so sorry. We celebrate performance wins.
You don't have to soundbite. You could talk more about it.
So we actually have a dashboard, right, that we put up, and it's like a picture of me and like the guy or girl who like made the actual performance win. So it's like we have the graph of what the speed used to be and how it improved. And
That's amazing.
we put it up on a big wall, and so we have a quarterly performance hero, and this really does help us prevent regressions.
I love that.
It's pretty good. Also, baked goods always help to bribe people to make their stuff good.
Literally, my first reaction was like, oh, so there's a cake. A cake is involved. Because I'm sold. I'll do pretty much whatever for a cake.
I like that.
Mm.
Soundbitey. Let's see.
You can't use baked goods. Let's take it.
Get the client to think like they're a user. You know, put themselves in their user's shoes. What does the user care about? What's the most valuable thing to them with regards to the service that they're trying to provide?
Yeah, I saw a tweet today, and I think it was a Karen McGrane quote that said, if all corporate executives had to use their phone for, like, only their phone for a month, sites would instantly become faster. And I think the other thing for after handoff is the idea of designing modularly, not creating a style that you don't need, and also throughout the entire design process, not just at the handoff, educating your client about why you designed that way, like why I chose to design a series of components and why I kept the type and the colors very limited, and kind of educating about that thought process and lead that into a documented pattern library so that someone if they're trying to add new pages or add new components afterwards, they can start from components that have already been optimized instead of starting from scratch with really bloated code.
Yeah, and to underscore that point, the style guide that we have internally includes copy and pastable HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, so people don't even have to think. They can just copy and paste existing highly performant stuff.
Yeah, that's so important.
So we've actually covered a lot of these so far, which I think means we're nailing this thing. But I'm no expert. But this is interesting. How much of the contents of a page should be lazy loaded? So besides like super obvious stuff like images that are below the fold, should this apply to all content that doesn't need to be immediately available? Like, should we lazily load text in a collapsible, like an accordion or a carousel, for example, something along those lines?
You love your carousels, huh?
I can't get enough. I love carousels. I love flash intros. Those are my two main things. Both mission critical for me.
So I mean, the obvious stuff is obvious, like you just said. Obviously, things that are hidden, that are not available to the user immediately, are great things that you can lazy load. My general concern with lazy loading is how editable it'll be in the future. How easy is it for someone who is new to working on the site or who wants to come and redesign it later? How organizationally optimal is that going to be? Because often that can create more problems than it has initially helped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We don't do a lot of that or we don't do as much of that as we used to. I think because we've started to just use other techniques that we've found to be just as successful. And to Lara's point, really, chopping up a page like that is not something you should consider lightly, right? It affects the CMS side of things. Yeah, I'd agree that some things, a lot of types of content should definitely be loaded lazily, like advertisements can be, especially if they're talking to third-party networks, can be pretty slow. We don't want that to hold up the page content. So, a lot of times ads are actually, critical to the site's content. Right? It's something they depend on being there. So it's not a question of whether or not it'll show up, but trying to deprioritize how that ad loading affects the rest of the page showing up or not sooner. It's really important.
Yeah, and I'll clarify. There's a distinction between lazy loading and asynchronous loading. And I think that what we're really aiming for here is always going to be asynchronous loading. So what stuff can we delay grabbing until we absolutely need it? I think that we talk about lazy loading, it's much more about like how can we fade in this image as you scroll down the screen, which adds a whole lot of complexity. But really the question is, how much can you asynchronously load? How much can you actually wait until you absolutely need it to load?
Yeah, sometimes social buttons can be brought in lazily on user interaction. Like my colleague at Filament, Zach Leatherman, built a tool for that. So just because they tend to be quite heavy, like Facebook's buttons and things like that.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, would you consider those to be ridiculously heavy or nightmarishly heavy?
I'm up to date on. I know they all work pretty hard on trying to get them as light as possible, but yeah, I'm not. That was pretty diplomatic, right?
Any questions? Radio silence. I'm doing a great job. Okay, so this is another more soundbitey one, because we've discussed this a little bit so far, a lot today. What are the most important front-end performance metrics to focus on? So, like, you're in an elevator, you're talking to somebody wearing shoulder pads, they're very important, and they're like, how do we know our website's fast?
That's a really good question.
Presumably they won't install a grunt task.
So the thing that I usually hit first when I'm talking to folks at metrics is speed index, which is a metric that's provided by Web Page Test. And it provides a visualization or a number that helps represent how fast the above-the-fold content loads for the test that's been run. And speed index is a pretty good metric for perceived performance. I mean, obviously not for scrolling jank and other things like that, but it'll help you basically get a sense of how fast your site is immediately loading for a user on that screen size.
Do you have a number, Lara, that you try to shoot for as far as speed index? Does it vary per page?
Yeah, we aim for 1,000. We try.
This can turn into a contest if you guys are coming. Who goes for the lowest speed index score? I go for 6, the number 6.
Yeah.
1,000's fine too. That's whatever.
Top 3 things for me: compression. Just make sure you're transferring everything in with gzip. Just it's such an easy thing to do. Any text files can be lightened so much just by transferring with compression. Looking at the critical path, figuring out what's blocking the page from showing up as quickly as possible, and images, just get them later. Video, whatever kind of media you're loading, just make sure they're light.
Yesenia, what are yours from a design standpoint? What are the big one or two or three things to...
Yeah, a lot of what we've already heard, making sure that the user is seeing that the site is loading. So again, just perception, making sure that it doesn't take a minute before they even see that something is happening. And from a design perspective, absolutely images and making sure that they're optimized is huge.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually have a couple of related questions going back to back. Is there a way to load certain fonts in a responsive manner? Meaning load 2 weights for a larger viewport and maybe only 1 font file for a smaller one. And that's like baked into the design. It's not, you know, compromising anywhere during the dev process. Is there a smart way to load those based on device capabilities? And to make things worse, how do you deal with that when it's coming from one of the big like font providers?
Scott, I think you should take this one.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah, we've done a lot of writing on font loading this year. We kind of thought we had everything figured out, and then like a month later we wrote a post that sort of said, this works even better than the first thing we found. So originally we were loading all our font files as data URIs baked into a CSS file, and we would just load that CSS file asynchronously, so it wouldn't block the page, and they just sort of snap into place whenever they loaded. But that loses a lot of the benefits that you get from using font face and the native capabilities in CSS to reference fonts. So our latest recommendation is to use font face to reference your fonts. And what's nice about that is that you can, by referencing fonts with font face, that doesn't necessarily trigger them to download, right? They're not going to download until, well, it varies by browser. But I see Lara shaking her head. But generally, to get back to your breakpoints question, if you were to say apply 2 weights to a couple elements at one breakpoint, then another one at another breakpoint, in theory, if things were working properly, that third font would only be requested if that breakpoint happened to be in play. So we generally don't, like, I can't think of a site where we've loaded particular fonts differently for a breakpoint. So that's sort of new to me, but what is pretty fresh is how we apply the font to the page to make sure that we show text before the custom font comes in. And we recently put an article on our site about that. It basically uses, it mimics fonts, which are a new thing coming into browsers now, where we can sort of listen and wait for a font, a custom font to load before we let it apply to the page. And I think that's really great. It works against that often really annoying behavior where you're just staring at a blank page while fonts are loading.
Yeah, and to support that, we at Etsy use that breakpoint trick, so we don't load custom fonts unless you're on larger screens. So we use breakpoints to help us figure out when to load different fonts, and so we're doing a little bit of testing there. We're also doing some testing with caching, so we can check a cookie to see if a font's already been loaded for a user, and if not, we can download the font asynchronously and show the regular text on the first page load.
Nice. So when you do that, you don't even show the font until they visit a new page?
Right, you got it. We're testing it.
I like that, yeah. It's hard to convince the design team sometimes to buy into that one.
Totally.
Yeah.
Designers.
Yeah, I was going to say, what do you have to say about that design?
So I have been in situations where we have loaded a smaller amount of, maybe like one web font for smaller devices, and then as you get to a desktop width, then you can have a more rich experience. And that was actually not even only for performance, but just because creating a type scale for a smaller device, having a ton of variation can be a little bit confusing, whereas for a larger viewport, you can have a little bit more of that typographic variation, and it doesn't start to look, I don't know, overly cluttered. So that initially started just because from a design perspective, scannability was easier with a more limited type system for smaller devices.
That's a great point. Laura, when you were shaking your head, have you written anything about like some of the discoveries you've run into with, you know, how it should work versus testing it and seeing, oh, it's not quite there yet?
Yeah, so thankfully this is like really local to IE, to old versions of IE, the issue that I was shaking my head at before. Just because IE 8 and lower download all the fonts that are referenced in a CSS file, whether or not they actually apply to the given page, and IE 9 and above with compatibility mode turned on also exhibit that same behavior. That was the only reason why I was shaking my head when you were talking about it, because modern browsers do a great job of it.
No, thanks. That's important to consider.
All right, so I think we have time for one more big question from an audience member who I stress is not me, and there's no pressure here. So with many sites using like visual storytelling with large images that are the content, how do you ensure fast load times if you've already ensured that the images are properly compressed and everyone's done their save for web clock correctly? Because compressing them too much, that looks very bad on Retina. Are there any solutions to this tricky issue of serving context-appropriate images to users of the web?
I would love to hear what Yesenia says.
I'm wondering if Matt is asking himself a question.
I want you guys to talk about responsive images for a while, but that's a real question somebody asked. That's legitimate. Probably some cool stuff out there to solve this, I bet. But you guys discuss.
It could be. Lara, Yesenia, someone want to take it? I'm happy to.
The key to moderating is to put all the panelists in the most awkward possible position.
So the audience has context here. The writer of one of the writers of the picture spec is also our moderator, and he is teeing us up to answer a question that really is directed at him.
Yes.
Well, I mean, it's directed to you guys. I'm just relaying. I'm just the messenger here. But yeah, legitimate question. How do you ensure fast load times if you have a ton of images and you've done all the compression and you've stripped out all the metadata and you've done everything Photoshop will allow you to do to make those images smaller? What do you do in terms of making a fast website despite that?
Go for it, Scott.
Okay. Well, Laura mentioned the new responsive image features that are now landing in browsers natively. So really neat. We have the picture element, which is HTML element like any other. Lets us sort of control the source of an image element. Gives the browser several options and criteria to determine which particular appropriate source should be applied to an image within that picture element. So that's pretty neat. It works pretty well for art direction when you're trying to pair particular content images with whatever happens to be happening in the layout at a particular breakpoint.
Yeah, I will say that someone on a marketing team loves the idea of being able to art direct an image based on the device size. So the image can be vast and show more background if you have a wide screen, but you might want to close crop when you're on a smaller device. So that's something that I think people that are focused on the marketing of a site are really excited about.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then the flip side of that spec is two attributes that we can apply to images, to image elements. Source set, size it. Using a combination of these two, we can sort of just offer up potential images that the browser can choose between based on conditions that it knows a little bit more about than we might as developers. So those conditions could be anything from device resolution, viewport size, network speed, anything that the browser deems relevant in the future. Those attributes sort of put the control in the browser's hands, which is nice if we're not looking for particular crops and stuff like that. Did you want to add anything about that? Did I miss anything?
Me? No, I'm just an impartial observer.
What about browsers that don't support those things, Matt?
Yeah, are there any good polyfills out there for that? You know? Is anyone right now? No? Nobody? I heard, what is it? Pictureful?
Yes.
Is that the one? The Picturefill polyfill, written by our own Scott Jehl.
And a larger team these days. Yeah, so there's JavaScript that you can use to make those features sort of work in browsers that don't understand them today. Yeah, you can find all those online.
All right, I promise I'm not going to close on that one. I'm going to give you guys a not super awkward question to actually close this thing out. And this is because I want to avoid all the many tweets that I feel like I'm going to see about this. We have brought up the fold like 20 times. What is the deal? Has the fold, in terms of like the above the fold critical CSS, are we drawing a new arbitrary line there? Does that matter? How do you decide where that the fold is?
Yeah, that's definitely not an awkward way to end this.
All right. I'll do one more after this. We have like 30 seconds.
All right.
Scott, you want to take this one too?
Yeah, I mean, there is no fold, right? I mean, it varies between every device and every viewport size on those devices. But it is fairly standard that web pages load from the top first, right? The first part of the page you see is the top. So if we can sort of get even a vague notion of a large subset of that page that constitutes the top that most users see, we can start to optimize how quickly we can make that portion render compared to the bottom of the page, which can take a little longer if we're not going to see it right away in the initial rendering. So to me, it doesn't need to be a controversial thing. We use this term a lot now. We stopped using it, now we're using it again. But I mean, I think it's useful shorthand to just say the critical portion of the page, the top area.
Yeah,
I wish we could find another name for it.
And to be real clear, the reason why we keep on throwing these things to Scott is because he wrote a really great book called Responsive Design. It's all about the squishiness of the web and how weird it is to talk about these things.
Thanks, Lara. But to back up from that, this technique is not my own creation. So a lot of developers at Google, Adi Osmani, Paul Finlan, all of this, were the first ones to blog about these ideas, and it just, kind of, I think, really changed the way we're thinking about perceived performance these days. So, pretty neat.
The big takeaway from the fold discussion is that the web is squishy and weird. I feel like that's the that's the bottom line. All right, and we are officially, even though we ended on a still pretty awkward question, we are officially out of time. I want to thank all of the panelists for joining us here today, and I want to thank all of the viewers at home or at work, at lunch, eating a sandwich. We also want to thank Pantheon again for their sponsorship, which is allowing us to try out new things like this. We've got a bunch of more ALA events planned, so be sure to sign up for our event emails, or just keep an eye on the Twitter account or listapart.com to hear about what we've got coming up. We look forward to seeing everybody at the next one. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.